So good afternoon, my name's Dave Copeland. Thank you for having me, I really appreciate it. I'd like to get out and talk about the topic I'm most passionate about, which is journalism and news. I've worked as a reporter and editor and writer for 30 years or so, give or take. And throughout the course of that career, I've kind of done everything from cover the little community meetings all the way to reporting from overseas. And so that's who I am. I've worked for the Dow Jones News Service as a business reporter. I've worked for a daily newspaper in Pittsburgh. I've worked for the Boston Globe. And right now, I work for myself. Last year, I started an online publication called Andover News, real simple name. And the reason I did that is because I'm very concerned about the decline of local news over the course of my career. I think if, depending on where you live, you probably you have a weekly or even a daily newspaper, and if you read it regularly, most likely you have noticed a decline in both the quality and quantity of coverage over the past, well, let's be honest, since the rise of the internet. And that's a problem. It's a huge problem. Right now, well, since 2004, more than 1,800 newspapers have closed in the U.S. and they continue to close at a rate of about 2 a week. And the ones that are left over are kind of a shell of what they used to be. They are, they've gone down from, multiple staff members covering a community like Andover, which has 36,000 people, a big school district, a active town government, and lots of anything else that goes on in a town like Andover. And at one point, the Andover Townsmen had 2 or 3 people covering that. Now they have 1. The copy editing is done in Arkansas. They're owned, as is the Eagle Tribune, by a hedge fund out of Arkansas. And the coverage, they rarely cover government. They rarely cover police and fire. Right now, they're publishing about 1, maybe 2 articles about Andover a month, and the rest are pulled in from their sister papers. This is happening in North Andover. This is happening in Middleton. I live in Andover. I don't care what happens in North Andover. I don't. I mean, I do to a certain extent, but local government has the biggest impact of all the government, federal, state, local. Local is the one that has the biggest impact on our day-to-day life. They educate our kids, they protect our property, they pick up our trash and then plow the streets. They have such a direct impact on everything we do, down to the water we drink. Yet journalism as an industry has tended to put more and more focus on the federal government, and that increased focus has not necessarily improved the coverage of the federal government. I see a lot of the blame for journalism's decline going on to the internet, which is true. It devastated the business model. It devastated the monopolies that local newspapers had. Digital media sites like mine do not have the legacy costs. We do not have the printing costs. So I could put this out by myself on a very bare bones budget. It's a lot of work, but to me, it's very important. I started my career in 1996 after graduating from college. I started my career at a company called MPG Newspapers. They were based in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Their flagship paper was in Plymouth, and then they had in 9 communities surrounding it, Duxbury, Kingston. They had weekly newspapers that served those communities. And there was one reporter assigned to every of those papers. And when I got my job, I was assigned to the Pembroke Reporter, and I covered everything in town. I was writing about 9 articles a week, covering meetings, select board meetings, planning board meetings, school committee meetings, and really learned the business from the ground up. I knew about this in college. It really got me to understand the government watchdog role that journalists and newspapers play in our communities. It showed me the importance of not just doing government coverage, but doing the slice of life pieces, the new business openings, the community events, nice thing or good things that were happening in the schools. And I did that for a year in Pembroke, and my editor on the first day explained to me what my job was. And he said, everybody in Pembroke has invested in this community. They've made the biggest investment of their lives by buying a house in this community, and they work 40 hours a week. They have families, which takes up a lot of time, and they can't keep eyes on the government. They can't always pay attention to what's going on in town, and your job is to go and make sure that coverage is done. Make sure they understand the town they live in. To me, a good newspaper or a good online news site is almost like an owner's manual for wherever you live. It tells you what's going on, it tells you how to access different services, and it keeps you feeling like you're in the know. After a year there, I got promoted to the flagship paper, which was called the Old Colony Memorial, or as we used to joke, the newspaper that sounded like it was a funeral home. And I was the business reporter. Plymouth at the time was a town of about 50,000 people, and there were 4 other reporters beside me. We had a full-time government reporter, a full-time police reporter, a full-time features writer. We had a full-time, what was the other one? We had 5 people. We had 2 photographers, 2 full-time photographers, copy editors, running the newsroom, assigning stories. Today, the Old Colony Memorial has exactly 1 employee. They were bought by Gannett, which is basically the newspaper holding company. It's the largest newspaper company in the country, but it's essentially feeding a hedge fund. These owners have gone up, they've scooped these local newspapers, they've gutted the staffs, they've moved copy editing and a lot of the other editing to a central location where the people editing the stories don't know the community. They don't pronounce Worcester as Worcester. And so that's the problem we're facing. It's just not a profession where people can survive. And the only reason that these newspapers continue to survive, the only reason they're not among the 2 a week that are closing in the US is they still make money. And the way they make money is they hire some kid just out of college like I was with no real guidance. I at least had people who had been doing it for decades to teach me the ropes. And they essentially survive on the legal notices that towns have to put into the newspaper. A newspaper like the Andover Townsman probably makes, I don't know, 70, 80,000 a year in legal advertisement, and they probably pay their 1 reporter 30,000 a year. And if you multiply that over across hundreds of papers across the country, it's a pretty good racket. As soon as they lose that legal advertising, or legal advertising slows, or cost of producing the newspaper increase, they close it. The advertising is still there, but it's not nearly as robust as it was. And that's the situation. I grew up in Melrose, and the Melrose Free Press published its last print edition on Thursday, July 29th, 2021. The paper's owner and the corporate giant that decided to pull the plug, Gannett, as I mentioned, after 120 years that this newspaper existed, called it a cost-cutting move. At the time, there were only 639 people remaining in the town of Melrose, which is a town of 11,329 households that were actually paid subscribers to the Melrose Free Press. And of course, they promised to keep covering Melrose online, but the last time I checked, the main website had not been updated in, I think it was about 8 months. Last week, we had a giant, well, let me back up a little. Anyways, I'm still in Plymouth, but I'm 23, 24 years old, and I still had this dream of being a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, or covering major corporations for the Wall Street Journal, or at least getting on a daily newspaper. But I loved that job in Plymouth. I loved how close I felt to the community, how I got out and met people, and I knew lots of things going on in town. I felt like I was a small but important piece of life in Plymouth. And one of the things I said at the time is that I loved that job so much, I probably would have stayed there forever if the pay hadn't been so miserable. I don't know if that's true. I think I had to go out. And so from there, I went to Dow Jones, then I went to Pittsburgh, came back to Boston, worked for a lot of tech and business websites, was a business writer for the Boston Globe. And then 5 years ago, 2017, I started working for a company called Patch Media. Patch Media was originally owned by America Online, that's an old name. And their idea was to fill the gap of all these closing newspapers with websites that had just local content, local news, like we had done back in the 90s before all these newspapers started declining. And Patch has had kind of an up and down existence, but they were free, and in a lot of the communities, they have about 1,200 of these sites across the U.S. You know, in some cases, that was the only local news coverage. I got there and I worked for the Massachusetts team as one reporter. When I started, I was covering 10 communities. Now remember, in Plymouth, I was one of 5 reporters plus an extensive staff behind us covering one community, one section of a community. Now I was covering 10 communities. I was promoted and I became the manager of a team of 10 journalists who were covering 110 communities in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. The quality of coverage was not there. Those reporters who had to write 5 to 7 articles a day just to not have me yell at them, and were really kind of expected to do more, they didn't have time to sit through a 3-hour school committee meeting or a 5-hour budget session of the city council. They didn't have time to follow up with things that they heard on the police scanner or things that showed up in the police log. They didn't have time to look at the police log. I will say I was at Patch for 5 years. In the first 4 years, we had an editor-in-chief for the entire newsroom, all 1,200 sites, who was making slow but steady strides to improve the quality of the coverage, to pay more attention to the government stories and the feature stories and a little less attention to the crime stories. The problem with this model is it's built around something called page views. Anybody familiar with page views? Page views. Every time you go to a website, that's one page view. If you click on another article or another link and that takes you to that website, it's 2 page views. Patch's basic financial model was 2 cents for every page view, 1 cent in expenses. My team, when I left, our goal was 8 million page views a month. You do not get a lot of page views when you cover a select board meeting. You do not get a lot of page views when you cover a school committee meeting unless it's something that's really going to tick off parents. Changes in schedules, bus problems, but generally speaking, what got the page views were dramatic weather stories. I'm sure they did really well last week when all those windstorms were ripping through the Merrimack Valley and the flooding last month. They, salacious crimes. Two of the best days I had in terms of page views when I was running the team were the day Tom Brady retired, the day Tom Brady unretired. It was great if you look at it at page views, but I was starting to kind of get sickened with the idea that this was what local news was considered. On a lot of days, we didn't even have a single article to put on, Bedford Patch or Chelmsford Patch because we were spread so thin. And the quality coverage was not there. But like I said, this editor-in-chief, he was there. He was making slow by steady strides. And what I'm most proud of, I have two things that I'm most proud of in my time in Patch, was our coverage of the Merrimack Valley gas explosions and the coronavirus pandemic. We really dug into both those issues, and I will put our coverage up against any coverage of anybody in terms of giving people the local information, not because it was interesting, not because somebody might want to read this, but because it was the things people needed to navigate this complex world. I've also written a book, and I have a literary agent, and so we're both really story guys. We're both really look at the world and try and understand what the story is. And his feeling is that the world is so complex, so confusing, so dangerous at times, so wonderful at times, that we almost have a sixth sense built into us to try and break it down into story, to tell stories as a way of making those things a little less complex, a little less scary, or a little better, a little more interesting, a little more meaningful. But basically, my job is to help people understand complex topics, not so complex topics. What's the cost of this decline of newspapers? Anyone want to guess? There's a lot. What are the pitfalls? What are the consequences, I guess I should say? Yes?
Manipulation.
Manipulation? Like government manipulation?
Business
Any kind of manipulation. That's a good one, yes?
Wait. Let's do this right.
Misinformation.
And the inability to correct it.
The inability to correct it, yes. Yes? Insufficient information. Good. Back of the room.
Actually, it wasn't me.
Oh, I saw a hand.
Yes.
Sarah Kimber online has her hand up.
Oh.
Corruption that isn't located. I
Say it again, Sarah?
Corruption, because reporters used to track things and find out and kept track of what was going on, so it was harder to do corrupt things. And now, without anybody watching, there's more corruption.
That's a really good point. Some of the most important stories I covered were stories I never actually wrote. It was just the process of going down, kicking the tires, asking all the questions, making sure that everything, as they say, was kosher. If there's nothing wrong there, we don't necessarily need to write a story saying city council is operating just the way we want it to. Not that city council ever operates the way we want it to, but that's sort of the mentality. You're doing a good job, even if you don't, your byline doesn't make it in the paper the following day.
We have a chat online from John Brand saying, government doing things without concern for citizens, concern or critique, in the worst case, corruption. And Simon Curry has his hands up. I'd like to ask a question.
Someone who?
Simon Curry.
Okay, great.
I was going to suggest just a concentration of power.
Yes, that's a big one. In Pittsburgh, I covered my job eventually became to cover widespread government corruption. The first 3 months I was there, I didn't write a single article because I was working with 2 other reporters on a deep dive look into the city of Pittsburgh's finances. And what we found is that Pittsburgh had a spending problem, like a lot of local governments. We essentially predicted that the city was going to go bankrupt 3 years before it did. That's an important story. We covered a scandal where, you ever see those trucks? They've been out a lot the past few weeks because of the flooding. They're called Vector trucks, and they go around and they suck all the leaves out of the sewer. The deputy mayor had given a contract to a friend of his. It was actually a woman he cheated on his wife with. It's a great story. So her contract was for every ton of leaf waste that she dumped, she got $55. But if she dumped it at the DPW, the town's DPW yard, she only got $45 because the city was taking the expense. She was dumping it at the DPW yard, and this deputy mayor was signing off on the $55 payment as opposed to the $45 payment. Our reporting basically ended up with her getting indicted. The deputy mayor skated through it, he got out, but some of the things that we found was this was just one of several scams. One of the scams was when the mayor was up for re-election, and I promise I'm not going to spend the whole time talking war stories, but it's interesting to illustrate the things that we could cover. And I say we because it was never one reporter covering these stories. The mayor, when he was up for re-election or throughout the year, he would have, one of the things they had in Pittsburgh at the time were these video poker machines. Every bar, almost every restaurant, they were video poker machines where if they all said for entertainment only, not for gambling, but it was every bar in Pittsburgh, it was a wink and a nod. You could talk to the bartender and they would pay you out your winnings. And they made a ton of money. A lot of bars in Pittsburgh and a lot of them were surviving on video poker. So the mayor would have his bag man go down to one of these bars and they would invite the entire police union, and they would everybody write a check for $100 to his campaign, have their wives write a check, sometimes it would in children's checks, and then they would take the proceeds from the video poker and pay him off. So if you wrote a check for $100 as a donation, you'd get $100. I always wondered if they paid it off in quarters. So there was all sorts of stuff like this, and it was months and months of reporting on all these stories. You can't do that now. It's really hard to do that if you're a lone independent news organization. Yes?
So one of the things I've found with the lack of local reporting is the lack of civic pride. For example, your kids do well on the local baseball team. It doesn't get covered, you send them articles, you send them photos, and nothing happens in the paper. And this happened to my kid, obviously. So the kids have no respect for any local journalism, they have no civic pride, they don't care about their town or where they live, because it doesn't care about them.
You just gave me a nice segue into my next point, in the sense that we're a divided country. I'm sure you're all aware. And yes, we can blame social media. We can blame the internet for giving us the information we want to support our point as opposed to the information that is accurate, factual. I can go online and pretty much find a site that looks very authoritative, real, I guess I'd say, and find, facts that will dispute anything you can think of, including whether the world is flat or not. That's a problem, and the way it happens in our country right now is it divides us. Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, social justice warrior, whatever the case is, you go through all this identity politics and we're all divided. And I think a local newspaper can be part of the solution to that problem, because you get to learn about your neighbors, you get to learn about the people in town, and you might not agree with them, but a good local newspaper can hopefully help you understand their point of view, so we can discuss it and not fight about it. So we can listen to hear as opposed to listen to respond. And to me, that's a vital role of local news coverage that we don't have or we're rapidly losing. To get back to kind of the impact of government, there have been some more and more studies recently. There was a 2008 working paper at the Hutchins Center, and they focus on municipal government as opposed to journalism. They found when the local newspaper closes, when a town goes out to borrow for whatever it is, borrow for capital projects, borrow for a new school, it increases the cost of that borrowing by 5 to 11 basis points when the local newspapers close. That adds on average to whatever the bond issue is, $650,000 to the cost of it. In Andover, we're talking right now of building a $455 million new high school, which in the past Andover has basically rubber stamped massive projects like that because they know only 500 people are going to show up at town meeting, and they're all the people that kind of support the power structure in town. But that project, since I've started covering it, now has people who are questioning whether you need a $500 million high school. And it has people looking at it. I'm undecided on it, and I wouldn't share my views on it. I will say, on one side, my wife and I are looking at a 22% increase on our property taxes if this goes for the next 30 years, which translates out to about $100,000. On the other side, I have a 7-year-old daughter. If they hurry up and get this, she'll get to go 4 years in a brand new high school. Yes?
We have a comment online for Jeff.
Great.
Jeff, if you want to unmute and read your comment, that would be great.
Because I keep looking over there when I
Sure.
If not, I can record.
No, I got it. I had to find the unmute. So I found a frustrating thing was with our last town election, I couldn't find information on the candidates. And that said, we had 2 people running for 1 seat on the Board of Selectmen, which is pretty important, the most important thing in the town.
Yeah, that could be the biggest service that's lacking right now is election coverage at the local level. And I think election coverage is a problematic top to bottom among journalism. Our presidential elections are covered like horse races. Our state elections are covered like horse races. And our local elections are rarely covered at all. At Patch, when I told you about this editor-in-chief, he spent 4 years really building it up, and one of them was no matter what, we were going to cover elections in every one of the towns that we covered. At the bare minimum, sorry, you know what I'm trying to say. At the bare minimum, we were going to have candidate profiles of everybody that was running in a contested race. So what town was that, the select board race?
It was in Chelmsford, and the difference in the election was actually one vote.
Wow. Was it an incumbent that won?
No, actually.
Oh, okay.
It was that person running against him.
At the very least, though, we wanted to have these candidate profiles, and our election coverage, again, was something that I would put up against everybody's election coverage, because no one else was sending you a news alert when the one vote was decided. The one vote Chelmsford election was decided. And I've watched some of those Chelmsford select board meetings. It's great entertainment. They really go for the throat with each other. Andover is very civil, boring. But to me, that's scary, because when you see 5-0 vote after 5-0 vote, you realize that they're a rubber stamp. And then what happened? I keep saying the 4 of the 5 years were good, and the last year was terrible. And the reason is again, this page view model that we're dependent on. 2 cents per page view, you need a lot of page views. And one of the problems is during COVID, because we were doing such a good job, our traffic spiked. We essentially doubled page views for the first 6 months after the lockdown, from March to September. And they set the advertising rates for the following year based on those numbers. And the interest started to decline, and revenue started to decline, and staff started to decline. So the decision was made, no more election coverage, because we had always viewed election coverage as not something that generates page views, but something that's ingrained into journalism 101. It's a public service, and it's a necessary thing for us to do. But they decided that wasn't worth it. I also always felt that you might not get a lot of readers, but you get the right readers, and you can get. Patch had kind of a bad reputation, and a lot of it's just being fluff or exaggeration and scare tactics. But this kind of said, they're covering this, but the Andover Townsman hasn't written a word about the election. So it wasn't unnecessary. You got a lot of people, but you got the right people. So that was cut. Lots of other stuff started getting cut. We had layoffs, and because I was so loyal to this editor-in-chief, I was forced out last October. And they've continued to decline. So around that time, I was building Andover News, and I decided that I was going to put everything into it and really try and build it, and hopefully be able to expand. If I could find a successful, profitable business model, even if it was just enough of a profit to hire somebody else and reinvest whatever was left over into the whole idea. I wanted to expand that to other communities in the Merrimack Valley, and I'm still want to expand that. I shouldn't say past tense. The fight's not over yet. And one of the things is we needed to have a paid, I keep saying we, but it's really a one-man band. I needed to have a paid subscriber base. Simple as that. It cost money to do this, and I would rather have people understand the breadth of the coverage, understand that I'm trying to get everything. The school stuff is such a good important component. Essentially, that's how I started reading newspapers. My name was in the newspaper, and I went to look it up. My Little League team won the city series, and I saw my picture, but then there was other fun stuff in there. There was other interesting stuff. All through high school, I would not miss the Melrose police log to see which ones of my friends were getting in trouble. And it grew from there, I started reading the Boston Globe for the comics and the sports page, but then I got interested in the Metro section and the front section. And then all of a sudden I decided that this was for me. This was in my blood. I often describe journalism, or for people who work in journalism, it's the addiction that doesn't have its own 12-step program. I could be doing a lot of other things and making a lot of other money, but I can't quit. And most of the people I've met in that. So Andover News has been growing slow but steady, which I think is good, because I'm figuring this out. It's interesting when you're a journalist, especially in the internet era, you only hear from people when they're upset, or when they're mad, or when they want to say bad things about your mother because you wrote something that they don't agree with, or that challenged their point of view. I would say for every 100 or so angry emails, I get one complimenting me. With Andover News, it's almost flipped. It's been very well received by the community. I get lots of praise. People don't normally take the time to tell you when you're doing something right, but they do. And it reminds me of being back at the Old Colony Memorial when people would come up and would be talking and they'd say, "What do you do?" And I would say, "I write for OCM." And people would declare their love. They would say, "I love OCM. I don't always agree with them, but it's such an important part of my week." We don't have that feeling about our newspapers anymore. I'm angry at most of the newspapers I read because of they're cutting corners, they're not checking their facts, they're really just telling us whatever government officials want to tell us. We used to have to double source everything. Now somebody can post something on Twitter and it's publish first, verify later. And frankly, somebody posting something on Twitter, whether it's LeBron James saying something, that's not really news until you go report it, until you talk to people that have a differing opinion, until you put it into the context. But it makes a great headline. So that's where we are. The other thing, I'm kind of jumping around here, but the other thing I should say when we talk about local news having the biggest impact on our life, what happened to all those people that stormed the Capitol? Why haven't they gone back?
What was the question?
What happened to all the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th? Why haven't they tried again or tried some other way to interfere with the operation of the federal government? And I don't want to get too political. I don't know where everybody stands on this, but go ahead.
I was in New York last weekend for the climate march, and I think a lot of people were doing civil disobedience that were associated with climate change protests.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was at the march, it was the most civil march that you can imagine. And I also heard that some of the civil disobedience by some of the protesters who caused some, disruption, they apologized to anybody who was disrupted because they want public opinion to side with the issue of climate change.
Yeah, and that's the way we're used to protests. We're not used to people storming the Capitol. But the reason, my theory is the reason we haven't, you kind of expected more to happen after it. You kind of expected another shoe to drop, but I think what happened is they realized you can't fight the federal government. But they're starting to realize you can fight City Hall. We saw last year during the election season, we saw so many school committee members not run for re-election because of the abuse they took during COVID and reopening the schools and vaccination policies. And that's not even touching on the identity politics, the attack, your curriculum's too liberal, your curriculum's too conservative, which those arguments have gotten just as ugly as the vaccination policy arguments. And what we're seeing now is people are coming back and they're running for local office because that's an achievable hurdle. Another story we did at Patch, which I was proud of because it's not necessarily something that would normally have the time to do, but we found a guy from Braintree. He'd been a high school teacher in Braintree, and he came back, or in February of, 2021, he suddenly resigned from his teaching position, And we found out it was because he had been at the Capitol riots, and then it came out that he had made awful comments about a transgender student in the school and some other things. He ran for, so after he resigned, he decided he was going to run for Braintree School Committee. He won because no one was there. You know, we finally broke the story a day before the election, but it was really too late for voters. And I don't say, you know, it would have swayed it, but it would have given people additional information to make their decision on election day. I'm sure that's happening elsewhere. I'm sure it's happening all the time, and it's not getting covered. Again, I don't want to judge I don't want to assume anybody's politics. I don't want to, you know, say this is a bad thing or a good thing, but I think you can tell from my tone, I don't think this is a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing that anybody gets elected where we haven't fully vetted and we haven't had a chance to fully understand their point of view and their position. But that's kind of the extreme example. If you're concerned about what's happening at the local government level, a lot of that concern stems from the fact that you're one of the few in your community who probably understands that there's some big stuff going on here. The other thing about it that's interesting about Andover News is I did a reader survey, and I'm 50. And I would say the majority, and I mean a real majority of Andover News readers are over the age of 50. And that's been the problem with news organizations as long as I've worked at it. We need to attract more younger readers. But even at that point, I remember in college, I had a subscription to the Boston Globe. I read it religiously every day before class. I was the only person I knew who read a newspaper every day. The habit's not instilled in people my age. It's completely gone in people younger than me. No one had an email address by the time I graduated college at UMass. But the next cohort that came through, they all had it, and it exploded, and we changed the way we get every kind of information. The big promise of the internet was, this is going to allow us to know everything. Everything we want to know will be at our fingertips, but the way it played out is, it's allowed us to go through life knowing nothing. You can look it up. You know, there's no need to argue, you know, I don't know. Did the Celtics win the '84 championship 4-2 or 4-3? You can just look it up. Now, obviously, there's more serious discussions, but you can, you know, presumably fact check it, but we don't use it that way. We go out and we look for the facts that support our worldview. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, I thought you raised your hand.
I'm just hanging out with the thing.
Okay. So that's kind of my spiel. I worry about the future of journalism for so many different reasons. I look back to when I started down in Plymouth, and I made horrible money, real bad money, but my situation was I would spend 40 hours a week working as a journalist, learn the craft, and then pick up a second job at nights to make ends meet. It's totally flipped. Anyone who wants to work in journalism now, I've done a lot of teaching. I taught journalism for 15 years at Bentley, Bridgewater State, Boston University. They have to work 40 hours a week at Starbucks as a bartender. At Bridgewater State, I used to joke that, you know, everyone in the communications department should be required to take a bartending class because that was the only way they were going to pay off their student loans. And then they have to try and figure out on their own, without the assistance of experienced editors and a staff, you know, how to do this at night when they've worked a 12-hour shift. I had a student who worked overnight shifts at, Channel 7 News, because she really wanted to learn the craft, and that was the only job she could get. And then she would go straight to our 10 a.m. class, no sleep. That's how dedicated she was and wanted to get it. So the education's not there, the readership's not there. And that leads me into this idea that the way we present and collect and report local news isn't working. We have to change it. We have to make it more relevant to people. We have to get those younger readers. And I'm not optimistic we can do that. Trying, I try new things every day. One of the things I try and do is be very transparent. My readers know that I'm covering the high school debate, but they also know I have 2 young daughters. And you can't be objective. You can be fair, and that's always the goal, the ideal I've strived for. But we're human beings, and a lot of journalists are smart human beings who can form opinions and arguments about what they're covering. They can't object. The decision to not cover a story, to say this isn't important enough to cover, is a subjective decision. So when you cover a story and you decide this is the most important thing and this is the context I need to put it in, those are all subjective decisions. But what I can do is be fair, and I can be as accurate as possible. I can quickly correct my mistakes, and I can be transparent. If you read Andover News, I will tell you I will tell you I don't vote in local elections, or I don't vote in contested races. I go and I check off the people that are running unopposed, because I don't feel I should vote in those contested races that I'm covering. You'd know that I'm covering the school system with one daughter in it and one daughter a few years away from being in it, because that's going to impact how I cover those stories. And I cover our school district. I'm pretty tenacious, so I'm always worried if it's going to come back to haunt my daughter, like, oh, your dad's that guy. I don't think they'll do it, but you got to worry about it. But that's sort of the problem we're facing. I hope my efforts are paying off, and we are seeing in Massachusetts, to the extent that the Independent News Association, which is kind of like a trade group for people that are doing what I'm doing, they call it the Massachusetts Miracle, because these things are popping up all over the place. In a lot of cases, they're community members are coming together and forming nonprofits. I interviewed for the editor-in-chief of one that was launching in Concord, one that was launching in Newton. There's one that's about to launch in Belmont. There's 2 in Marblehead. And they're popping up all over the place. Some cases, it's not even people who are trained journalists. They're just, they just understand that, they need to tell people about what's happening in local government meetings. And that, to me, is great. It's wonderful, but it's grassroots. We're not getting the money. We're not getting nearly as many page views because we're not writing real sexy headlines like New York Post style headlines that make clicking on that irresistible. We're just trying to give people the news. I sometimes compare it to, like, I sometimes tell people I'm doing artisanal journalism. Like, I'm doing it the way they used to do it. It used to be a craft, and or I'll say, like, Patch and Gannett, they're the McDonald's of journalism, and I'm trying to be that one-of-a-kind, unique corner restaurant in wherever you live, that you're not going to find everywhere else. Like, if somebody comes to visit you, this is the place you take them to show them what your community is like. And that's what I'm trying to be. I'm trying to not mass produce this. I will not cover anything that doesn't happen in Andover. Unless it's like, someone from Andover was seriously injured in a crash in North Andover. I just don't have the time, and I just don't have readers that care about that stuff. But for a lot of other places, most of the days when I get Andover Patch, if they have an Andover story, they've rewritten a police press release without asking any questions. And usually it's just some story from another town, or it's a statewide story, or more and more, as they've cut back on staff, it's a national story. Yet they claim they are the leading source for hyper-local news. No, I am. I am, at least in my little town, and hopefully in some other towns as we move forward. I wonder if this is a good place for me to stop and take some
Yeah.
questions or take a
See if
break,
there's any, let's see if there's any questions and if.
or comments.
We got a hand up.
Jeff's got his hand up again?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, so I had a comment and a question. The comment is, I'm surprised that you wouldn't vote in your contested seats, since you'd be obviously an educated voter. You just don't have to share what your vote was. But that's just a comment. My question is, what's your thought on the nonprofit model that some places are taking?
I think it's a great model. I think it's, at the very least, I'd rather have a nonprofit than nothing, no coverage at all. When I interviewed both with the Concord, they called it the Concord Bridge, and I think it was the Newton Beacon, both of them were insistent on doing a weekly print edition. They were going to be an online news source that would post articles as they happened, not wait for Thursday when the paper came out to post it online. But they wanted this print edition, and I just couldn't buy into it. I realized I love print. I love the physical newspaper. I love the ink on my hands. I love that as I turn each page, an article, a photo, a layout might pull me in, and I'll spend the next few minutes reading about a topic that I didn't even know I was interested in. That doesn't happen on the internet. We click on this because we're interested. We click on this because we're interested. We click on this, but we never click on the stuff that we don't know we're interested in. So along those lines, I felt, the tens of thousands of dollars a year they were going to spend on printing this could be put back into actually covering the news. I really wish print could survive. The other issue I think that you're going to see come up with nonprofit models is a board of directors who doesn't necessarily want to keep hands off and trust the people, the journalists, to do this. I think, that was definitely the sense I got in Concord, and to a lesser extent in Newton. In some cases, these boards have elected officials or former elected officials on it. They're very good intention, but I think there hasn't really emerged a kind of set of best practices. Now, that being said, I don't necessarily have a problem with government officials and journalists working together, in the sense that there's, elected officials can help promote it. A good elected official understands that when I call them up and I'm asking really tough questions, it will ultimately strengthen whatever it is they're proposing. If people can really take a hard look at it and understand all the angles of it. So, but, and the other point, related to that is, I think it's time to rethink how we do this. I've seen it once. When I started my career, you had a lot of people my age running newsrooms who thought the internet was going to be a fad, and just didn't think it was important enough. And then they reluctantly started posting whatever was in that day's paper online. But by that point, all these other digital media companies had risen up. They had taken their readership, and not necessarily even for local news. Sometimes people just want to look at pictures of cats instead of read about local news. And all this stuff on YouTube becomes far more interesting. And we've broken the habit. There's just not a lot of people who understand local news, who pay attention to local news. and most frighteningly, don't even know how to get local news. They go to Facebook groups, which could be vicious. We had a girl in Andover get hit by a truck and killed at what was a very dangerous intersection. Again, to pat myself on the back, I was relentless in the coverage. I asked a lot of questions. Why would you have this intersection with 6 roads converging? Why would you not have a dedicated pedestrian phase for people to cross with no traffic coming? Why would you allow right turn on red in the roads that were coming in with no visibility? And they've made the changes to that intersection, but one of the things that's happening on one of these Andover Facebook groups is now people are complaining that the new left-hand turn lane, right-hand turn lane, whatever it is adding, they have to wait an extra 2 minutes in the morning to make that right turn onto Essex Street. That's not news. That's just people being people, arguing about it. And so, but a lot of people rely on these Facebook groups to find out what's going on in town. And these Facebook groups, they're not going to bring up everything that people might be interested in. And that's where I come in. I read the Facebook groups and then try and find out what the real story is behind what people say the real story is. And that's where I come from. I try to be fair. I'm sure that I'm always not. One of the things I learned at Plymouth too, very first day, there was another guy started who had been doing it for 10, 15 years. And he said, you'll know you're doing your job right if everybody on every side of whatever story you covered tells you you got it wrong. Then you know you've done it right. If an elected official ever comes up to me and says, oh, I loved your story about me, I'm like, I messed up. He's not supposed to love it. Sorry.
I see Stan also has a hand up online.
I think I got unmuted. A couple things. One, you've talked about the various efforts here, there, and everywhere, and it seems to be a scattered effort. We talked about nonprofits a little bit. A lot of your costs and problems have to be what I call hidden costs. Getting your site up and running, managing your subscription base, collecting your bills, that sort of thing. That might well be helped by a larger organization. And the other question is, and you touched on it earlier, all news is local. My kids in particular would love to have information about the school committee meeting, about their own local school. We've all gotten used to, I'll call it the death of $7.99, of paying $7.99 a month for whatever, your local streaming service, your local whatever. Is that a viable issue, is to get them hooked, maybe by school committee meetings for $3 a month or $2 a month, that sort of thing, and get up to the other news? Because the other thing, I do agree with you, the local town groups are hit and miss, mostly miss. Most of them are somebody complaining about something, and the amount of news is small. So I guess I've rambled, and I guess my question is, how do we make this a true movement, a true format, a true something where we can start making real progress at it?
Oh. If I knew the answer to that, I think I would have already saved the day.
You'd be a millionaire and complaining about the likes of us. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things is, I taught, like I said, and there was kind of a wide gap. I love both sets of students, but my students at Bentley were much different than my students at Bridgewater State. And the reality is I taught writing at Bentley. We didn't really have a lot of discussions along this. They were accountants, tough job teaching accountants how to write. But at Bridgewater State, I did more journalism classes, I did communication studies classes, and one of the things that got progressively worse over the 15 years I was there was media literacy. I think at the very basic level, we need media literacy classes at a very young age. As young as middle school, if not elementary school. High school's too late. Their patterns are established. They're already on TikTok.
Could you repeat what you said? I didn't catch the beginning.
We need required media literacy classes in schools, and we need to start them. You know, I think some high school districts have it, but my argument is high school's too late. They've developed the habits of, you know, that to get their information. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. You know, I think, you know, there are teachers within it, but the lack of media literacy or, you know, it just declined over 15 years. It's getting worse as the internet continues to take over more and more of our lives. The other thing I think that could happen in Massachusetts that would help these startups is right now that Massachusetts has a law that basically says these legal notices have to go in a publication that has a print edition. And to me, that's very antiquated, especially if no one's reading in the print edition. These legal notices are very important. It could be your neighbors putting up a big edition that's gonna block your view or the sunlight you get for your plants. We have one in Andover right now where people didn't know that they were building a drug treatment center in their neighborhood. You know, so I think if the law could be changed to just put those legal notices out to an open bid process, like the towns do everything else, and not care whether there was a print publication to go along with it. I think that would help these things with these independent startups from a financial. I've already looked at kind of newspapers, how much they charge for these, and I know I could do it for next to nothing, literally next to nothing, because I don't have those expenses. And I know I would get it out to a broader audience. And at the same time, for me, I mean, I read every legal notice. Every week I go through all the previous week's legal notices for Andover because there's great stories in there. Just found out that there's like the police chief about once a week has hearings on dangerous dogs, which is a story I want to dive into. I think that's an interesting story about, you know, your dog bites someone and now you're going before the police chief for a hearing on whether or not your dog's going to get put down. So I think those are two kind of tangible ideas on how we can go about it. But they're above my pay grade. I actually have talked to people in Andover about possibly, you know, doing a town meeting article that would allow the town to petition the state government to lift the printed publication. And there's some precedent because some of these towns have had to do that because they don't have a local paper anymore. Bedford just passed one, and it's waiting kind of the stamp from the state legislature. So there is a precedent for it, but you know, it gets into this kind of area of politics that, you know, if I propose a town meeting article, I'm advocating for it. And can I cover that town meeting? Can I cover that issue? So, and in terms of the curriculum, I mean, it's so hard to change a school curriculum, and there's so much, really the only way you can do it is run for school committee and make a lot of noise to get that curriculum change. Teachers aren't allowed to change curriculums anymore. Superintendents bring in their own curriculum, but you know, rightfully people are concerned about like the basics, the math, the sciences, the English, the social sciences or social studies, but why not media literacy? Why not teach people how to differentiate between factual and slanted information? Why not teach people how to navigate and find the information that they're looking for? Not for a research paper. I feel colleges spend a lot of time teaching students how to write research papers that, unless they go to grad school, they're never gonna have to write again. Why don't we teach them how to write for the real world? Why don't we teach them how to find the information they need for the real world? Why don't we explain to them how the government systems work? There's not even a basic understanding. I remember some of my undergrad students saying to me like, well, what does Congress do? As people are storming Congress, I'm like, it might be too late. Let's talk about this and see how this plays out tomorrow, because Congress might not be there tomorrow. You know, this is in the hours after it started, but it was horrifying to me. You know, one of the things, and this is in 2008, so this is even closer to when it happened. I mentioned Rodney King. 20 blank faces. Never heard of Rodney King. It's not only a pivotal time in race relations in this country, but it's a pivotal time in media relations, or media in this country, in the sense that all of a sudden everybody with a camera, and we all have them now, can become a journalist. They can break a story. So I think, you know, those are kind of the high level. I think that, you know, people can do what I'm doing. You don't necessarily have to go all in like I am. Even, you know, the League of Women Voters will often, you know, they host political forums. They have members who attend some of these meetings, and they will take notes and just kind of highlight. That's better than what we have now. But at the very least, we can try and find ways to support local news. And usually that just is simple as reading. You know, my model is people will get X number of free articles. They can register for the site for free, and they get a few more extra articles per month. But if they subscribe, they get unlimited access. But certain articles I make available to everyone because I feel it's a public service. Town meeting articles, election articles, the big storm we had last week, when it wasn't necessarily this is what's happening, but this is what you need to do if you have flooding. This is what you need to do if your power's out. This is what you need to do if you have a tree on your house. And most of us did. So anyways, I know I'm kind of rambling, but I hope I'm raising some interesting points.
So I think we should take a 10-minute break. So we're gonna get 2 phone